Some stories are so dark, they refuse to stay buried. Tonight, we're stepping inside one of America's most chilling mysteries. If you're new here, welcome to Eternal Obsidian, where the past never sleeps. Make sure to subscribe, because this is a story you don't want to miss. In 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was a quiet farming town in Montgomery County with a population of just over 2,000 people. Like many small Midwestern communities, it thrived on agriculture, corn and wheat fields stretching out from its borders, and livestock feeding much of the region. The railroad cut through the town, bringing both trade and connection to larger cities such as Council Bluffs and Des Moines. Shops lined the main street, general stores, blacksmiths, and implement dealers, and advertisements in the local newspapers revealed a community that was modestly prosperous and close-knit. Despite its size, Villisca was modernizing. Electricity had reached parts of the town, though kerosene lamps still lit many homes. Telephones were in use but not yet widespread. The rhythms of life were largely set by the land, the seasons, and the churches. Religion occupied a central place in the community's identity, with Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist congregations anchoring much of its social life. Newspapers chronicled not only farm prices and town politics, but also the church socials, school performances, and picnics that filled the calendar. Crime was rare. When the Villisca Review or the Villisca Letter mentioned arrests, they usually involved drunken disputes or petty theft. In a town where families knew one another by name, violent crime felt distant, something read about in big city papers but never expected at home. That sense of security would soon prove tragically fragile. Among Villisca's respected residents was the Moore family. Josiah Moore, known as Joe, was 43 years old in 1912 and had built a reputation as a successful businessman. He operated a John Deere implement store and was active in the Presbyterian Church. Years earlier, he had worked under Frank Jones, a prominent merchant in town, but broke away in 1907 to open his own business. The departure was not entirely amicable, and the rivalry between the two men became an open fact of local life. His wife, Sarah, 39 years old, was equally well regarded. She taught Sunday school and managed the household with care. Together, the couple were raising 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. Their 2-story frame house at 508 East 2nd Street was modest but comfortable, a reflection of middle-class life in rural Iowa. On the night that would later gain infamy, the Moore children were joined by 2 guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, daughters of a nearby farming family. Lena was 12 years old, Ina just 8. The sisters had spent the day in Villisca and were invited by Catherine to stay overnight. The decision was a common one in small towns where children moved freely between households and families trusted one another without hesitation. Law enforcement in Montgomery County at the time was basic by modern standards. The county sheriff handled major incidents, while towns like Villisca relied on small local officers. Forensic science had barely begun to take hold in America. Fingerprinting, though known, was rarely used in Iowa. Crime scenes were easily disturbed, since few procedures existed to preserve evidence. In an era before state crime laboratories or standardized investigative training, much depended on eyewitness accounts, hurried notes, and the interpretations of local officials. Beyond Villisca, the country was changing quickly. In 1912, William Howard Taft was president, Theodore Roosevelt was challenging him on a progressive ticket, and Woodrow Wilson was preparing to become the Democratic nominee. Cities were growing rapidly, but towns like Villisca held firmly to their rural traditions. News traveled by wire and train, and when something remarkable occurred, papers across the country carried it far beyond its place of origin. This would soon be the case with Villisca. June 9, 1912 was a Sunday, and the day followed its usual course. Families rose, attended services, and gathered afterward. That evening, the Presbyterian Church hosted its annual Children's Day program, an event that drew families together to hear recitations, songs, and prayers from the town's youth. Sarah Moore helped organize the program, and her children participated. The Stillinger girls were in attendance as well, and by night's end, they accompanied the Moores home. Neighbors saw them returning to the house shortly after 9:30 p.m., their lanterns lighting the walk through quiet streets. It was an ordinary summer evening in a town that seemed safe from the world's harsher edges. Nothing in Villisca's history had prepared its people for what would unfold before dawn, and no one could imagine how quickly their community would become a national headline. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, Villisca moved to the rhythm of a warm summer evening. At the Presbyterian Church, the congregation gathered for the annual Children's Day program. It was a popular event, featuring recitations and songs by the town's youth, and it drew a large crowd that filled the pews. Among the participants were the Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, watched with pride by their parents, Josiah and Sarah. The Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, had also attended. They were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived several miles outside of town. After the program ended, the girls accepted an invitation from the Moores to spend the night at their house. Catherine Moore and Lena Stillinger were close in age, and such sleepovers were a common occurrence among school friends. Eyewitness accounts confirm that the Moore family and the Stillinger girls left the church at roughly 9:30 p.m. Neighbors later testified to seeing them walking along the quiet streets toward the Moore residence. No one reported anything unusual. The family's two-story house stood at 508 East 2nd Street, just a few blocks from the church, and by around 10 p.m., the group was inside. From that moment forward, the events of the night can only be pieced together through the grim evidence discovered the following morning. There were no surviving witnesses from inside the house. What is known with certainty is that sometime between midnight and 5 a.m., an intruder, or possibly more than one, entered the Moore home. Some investigators later speculated that the perpetrator may have hidden inside the house before the family returned from church. This idea was based on details at the crime scene, including a lamp with its chimney removed and matches found nearby, suggesting careful movement in the dark. Several windows in the house had been left open, and one of them likely provided the killer's point of entry or exit. There was no evidence of forced doors. What followed was an act of violence almost unparalleled in American crime at the time. Every member of the household, along with the Stillinger sisters, was murdered with an axe. Josiah Moore, in the master bedroom, was struck repeatedly in the head, so severely that his wounds were later described in coroner's reports as catastrophic. Sarah Moore, beside him, suffered similar blows. In the children's rooms, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were each killed in their beds. In the guest room downstairs, Lena and Ina Stillinger were attacked as they slept. Evidence suggested that Lena, the elder of the two Stillinger girls, may have awakened during the assault. She was found in a different position than the others, indicating she might have tried to resist or move. Ina, only 8 years old, remained still beneath her bedclothes. The official inquest records make clear that the brutality was systematic, the killer moving from room to room with grim precision. The murder weapon was found at the scene, a separate axe head, not belonging to Josiah Moore, which had been used throughout the attack. Its presence, along with the locked doors and windows open for ventilation, confirmed that the killer had been able to enter, carry out the murders, and leave the weapon behind. Other strange details stood out. Investigators noted that mirrors and glass surfaces in the house had been covered with cloths or clothing. A plate of food was left on the kitchen table and a bowl of bloody water was found nearby, though whether the killer actually stopped to eat has never been proven. These details were reported in early newspaper coverage and noted in official testimony. Based on the condition of the bodies and statements later provided by doctors, the time of death was placed between midnight and 5 a.m. Neighbors did not report hearing any screams or disturbances. In a town where homes were close together, this silence puzzled both residents and investigators. It suggested either that the attack was swift and muffled, or that no one had stirred in time to raise an alarm. By dawn, Villisca began to stir as usual, unaware of what had happened during the night. The Moore's absence was first noticed when a neighbor, Mary Peckham, realized the family had not come outside to do chores. Around 7 a.m., she grew concerned and attempted to investigate. What she discovered set in motion one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. On the morning of June 10, 1912, Villisca awoke to a Monday like any other. Farmers rose early to tend their fields, shopkeepers prepared for the day, and the town streets slowly filled with the routine hum of life. At the Moore residence, however, there was only silence. Next door, Mary Peckham, an older neighbor, noticed the absence of movement at the usually busy house. Josiah Moore was a man of regular habits, and by 7 o'clock he could typically be seen tending to chores outside. That morning the yard was still. Peckham watched for a while, expecting to see children appear or Sarah Moore step out, but the house remained shuttered. By 8 a.m., her concern deepened. She crossed the yard and knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried the door and found it locked. Peckham let the family's chickens out, a chore Sarah usually handled, then returned home and telephoned Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Telephone service in Villisca was limited but functioning, and Ross lived only a few blocks away. Within minutes, he arrived at the house. Like Peckham, he knocked and called out, but there was only silence. He produced his own key, inserted it into the lock, and stepped inside. The details of what happened next were later given in sworn testimony. Ross Moore entered the parlor and made his way toward the guest bedroom on the ground floor. What he saw there was enough to confirm his worst fears. The bodies of Lena and Ina Stillinger lay in the bed, covered but unmistakably lifeless. Horrified, Ross backed out of the house and told Peckham to summon the town marshal. Marshal Henry Hank Horton was among the first officials to arrive. Accompanied by Ross Moore and several townspeople, he entered the home and conducted a hurried inspection. Moving upstairs, he discovered the bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore in their bed. In the adjoining rooms, the Moore children lay dead as well. Each had been killed in the same brutal manner. Word spread quickly through Villisca. By mid-morning, dozens of townspeople gathered outside the house. Despite the marshal's efforts, the crime scene was soon compromised. Curious onlookers entered the house, some moving objects, others touching the walls or furniture. Early newspaper reports and later testimony admitted that by the time county officials arrived, much of the evidence had already been disturbed. Sheriff Orrin Jackson of Montgomery County and Dr. Cooper, the county coroner, were summoned to the scene. They confirmed the deaths and ordered the home sealed, but the damage from uncontrolled entry had already been done. Estimates vary, but it is believed that well over 100 people walked through the Moore house that day before proper barriers were established. Reporters from the Villisca Review were quick to publish the first accounts. By that afternoon, the story had spread to the Des Moines Register and the Omaha Bee. Headlines described the 8 slain with an axe and emphasized both the horror and mystery of the crime. Within 24 hours, the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls were national news. Neighbors and relatives, interviewed later, recalled the scene outside the house that day as chaotic. People whispered in small knots on the street, speculation running wild. Some claimed to have seen strangers in town the night before. Others insisted the killer must have been local. Fear mingled with morbid curiosity. For the officials on the scene, the immediate task was grim. The victims were formally identified, and their bodies were examined by physicians who determined the approximate time of death as being between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning. The murder weapon, Josiah Moore's own axe, was recovered from the house, stained with blood and hair. It became the central piece of physical evidence. The discovery left Villisca reeling. A community where neighbors rarely locked their doors now found itself confronted with a crime of almost unimaginable brutality. By the end of June 10th, what had been an ordinary farmhouse on East 2nd Street had become the focus of one of the most infamous murder cases in American history. Investigators who entered the Moore house found a tableau that left little doubt about the manner of death, even as many questions remained. In the guest bedroom on the ground floor, the 2 Stillinger girls lay in the bed where they had slept. Upstairs, Josiah and Sarah Moore were together in the master bedroom, and the 4 more children were each found in their respective sleeping places. Every victim bore multiple, crushing blows to the head delivered with a heavy, bladed instrument. Physicians called to the scene recorded blunt force trauma to the skulls as the cause of death, and their testimony at the coroner's inquest later reiterated that the wounds were consistent with a single implement used repeatedly. The murder weapon recovered at the scene was the household axe belonging to the Moores. Coroner and sheriff reports described the axe as the Moore family tool. It was found inside the house with blood and hair on its head and handle. Its presence, combined with the pattern of wounds and the absence of other obvious weapons, led officials to conclude early that the axe had been used in every killing. Aside from the axe, no other bloody instruments were reported as part of the scene in official testimony and contemporary newspaper descriptions. Certain features of the house captured investigators' attention and shaped the earliest lines of inquiry. Several mirrors and glass surfaces throughout the home had been covered with cloth or clothing. Witnesses and subsequent reports noted garments thrown over bedroom mirrors and, in at least one instance, coverings on a window. A plate of partially eaten food remained on the kitchen table, suggesting domestic activity had been interrupted. Some household lamps and light fixtures were found altered or displaced, and small items such as matches were reported in the kitchen area. Details that law enforcement testimony identified as part of the immediate scene observations. Perhaps the most puzzling practical detail was the condition of the entrances. When Ross Moore and neighbors first approached the house, the front door was locked. Ross later used his key to gain entry. Inside, interior doors to bedrooms were closed or locked in ways recorded in inquest testimony. These locked doors, the covered mirrors, and the lack of any clear sign of forcible entry were facts emphasized repeatedly in the early record and in newspaper coverage, and they contributed to the enduring mystery about how a killer entered, moved through the house, and departed without being seen. Autopsies and coroner testimony provided the medical backbone of what could be stated with certainty. Physicians who examined the bodies described extensive skull fractures and brain injuries from multiple blows. They estimated time of death as sometime between midnight and dawn, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and other standard observations of the period. The coroner's record indicated no credible signs of sexual assault, and no reliable evidence of poisoning or of defensive wounds that would suggest prolonged struggle in common areas. Though some victims showed indications consistent with brief awakenings or movement during the attack, notably the older Stillinger girl, whose posture differed from the others in ways raised repeatedly during later testimony. The physical evidence that might have helped identify a perpetrator was, however, greatly compromised before trained investigators arrived. Dozens of townspeople and curiosity seekers entered the house on the morning of discovery. Items were moved, bedding was handled, and rooms were walked through without systematic documentation. Law enforcement officers who testified at the inquest and in later proceedings noted that this uncontrolled traffic significantly diminished the value of potential trace evidence and made it difficult to reconstruct with certainty the sequence of events inside the home. Routine forensic steps, securing perimeters, recording positions of objects, preserving fingerprints, were not in practice in that small-town setting in 1912, and they could not be retroactively applied after the crowd had circulated through the rooms. What remained after that early contamination were the most concrete elements. The victim's wounds, the Moore family axe with blood and hair consistent with its use at the scene, the covered mirrors and windows, the plate of food left on the table, and the locked front door. Those facts, recorded in coroner's testimony and in contemporaneous newspaper accounts, established the basic physical picture of the crime. They also set constraints on plausible theories. There was no clear sign of robbery, for example, and valuables in the house appeared undisturbed according to inventories later reported, while pointing to how critical timely, uncontaminated evidence would have been in identifying who had carried out the killings. The coroner's inquest and the subsequent official record therefore presented a double truth. The medical and material facts made the brutality and method undeniable, yet the loss and disturbance of potential physical clues left investigators with a limited toolkit. Those concrete, verified details, what was found where, the nature of the injuries, and the condition of the household, became the durable foundation for the hundreds of pages of testimony, newspaper dispatches, and later scholarship that would try to explain the crime, even as many questions born of that first, chaotic day remained unresolved. In the days after the discovery of the 8 bodies in Villisca, investigators faced an enormous challenge. The crime had been brutal, deliberate, and yet left behind very little that pointed directly to a culprit. With no clear physical evidence and a crime scene compromised by early contamination, the investigation turned quickly toward possible suspects. The names that rose to prominence came from within Villisca itself as well as from surrounding regions. One of the first theories centered on business rivalry. Josiah Moore had once worked for Frank Jones, a powerful local businessman and state senator. Moore had managed Jones's farm implement store in Villisca for years before breaking away in 1907 to open his own John Deere dealership. The departure was not amicable. Moore's new business took significant customers from Jones, including a contract with the Montgomery County Fair, and rumors in town described lingering animosity. Some accounts from townspeople suggested Moore and Jones no longer spoke to one another. Because of this strained history, suspicion fell on Jones, though there was no direct evidence linking him to the murders. In newspaper reports and later court proceedings, the theory took shape that Jones might have hired someone to kill Moore. The name that became attached to this idea was William Blackie Mansfield, a man with a record of violent crime. Mansfield was investigated as a possible hired killer, in part because he was later suspected of murdering his own family in Illinois in 1914 and was accused of similar crimes in Kansas and Colorado. Prosecutors attempted to connect Mansfield to the Villisca killings, arguing he followed a pattern of using an axe and covering windows. In 1916, he was arrested and brought to Montgomery County, but a grand jury refused to indict him, citing insufficient evidence. Alibis placed him elsewhere at the time of the 1912 murders, and official records show he was released. Another name that drew intense scrutiny was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister who had been present in Villisca on the night of the murders. Kelly had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church on June 9th, where he was said to have been acting strangely, and he left town on a train early the next morning. A deeply eccentric figure, Kelly had a documented history of mental illness, voyeurism, and odd behavior around young women. He returned to Villisca weeks later, inserting himself into the investigation by writing letters to authorities and newspaper reporters. His fixation on the case eventually attracted suspicion. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Reverend Kelly was indicted and tried for the killings. During questioning, he gave a confession, but it was quickly recanted, and evidence showed it had been obtained under coercive circumstances. His first trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial resulted in an acquittal. Official records show that no physical evidence ever tied him to the scene, and despite his erratic behavior, the jury found the state's case unconvincing. Other drifters and potential suspects were considered in the immediate aftermath. Reports in newspapers from across Iowa and Nebraska told of strange men seen near Villisca in the days before June 10th. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a man sleeping in nearby barns, while others spoke of a stranger observed walking away from town early on the morning of the murders. Because the Moore home had been locked, investigators considered whether the killer might have been a transient who slipped into the house and waited until the family was asleep. But none of these leads produced concrete results. For law enforcement, the lack of fingerprints, usable footprints, or other material evidence left them dependent on confessions, rumors, and circumstantial connections. This reliance was reflected in the official inquest testimony, which acknowledged more than once that too many people had entered the house before evidence could be secured. The inability to isolate a suspect with physical proof meant the case quickly expanded into competing theories, many shaped by personal enmities, reputations, or the later violent histories of men like Mansfield. By the end of 1917, 5 years after the murders, none of these suspects had been convicted. Frank Jones, though accused by some of arranging a killing, never faced trial and remained an influential figure in Iowa politics. Mansfield, though charged with other crimes, was legally cleared of the Villisca case. Reverend Kelly, the only man ever tried, walked free after acquittal. What remained was a list of names, a set of theories, and a town left without resolution. By the time investigators focused their attention on suspects, Villisca was no longer just a small Iowa town. Its name had spread across the nation. From the day the bodies were discovered, newspapers in Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, and as far away as New York carried daily reports. Headlines emphasized the brutality of the killings, and readers across the country followed the story of the axe murders in Villisca. The level of attention was extraordinary for a rural crime in 1912, and it was sustained for years as suspects came and went. The earliest legal proceedings were the coroner's inquest, held in Montgomery County in mid-June 1912. Witnesses included Ross Moore, Marshal Henry Horton, Sheriff Orrin Jackson, and neighbors such as Mary Peckham. Their testimony described the discovery of the bodies, the conditions inside the house, and the placement of the victims. The inquest concluded with confirmation of homicide by an unknown person or persons, but no definitive suspect was identified at that time. Public pressure mounted quickly. With 8 victims and a town in fear, people demanded answers. Rumors flourished in cafes, churchyards, and newspaper letters to the editor. Some residents whispered about outsiders, while others pointed toward local rivalries, particularly the long-standing tensions between Josiah Moore and Frank Jones. Though Jones was never formally charged, he remained the subject of suspicion in local gossip, a fact widely reported in Iowa newspapers. By 1916, attention turned to William Blackie Mansfield, a known criminal who had been accused of murdering his own family with an axe in Illinois 2 years after the Villisca killings. Detectives argued that Mansfield had a pattern of crimes that mirrored the Moore murders, including the use of an axe, the covering of mirrors, and the locking of doors. He was arrested and brought to Montgomery County for questioning. A Montgomery County grand jury reviewed the evidence but ultimately refused to indict him. Alibi testimony placed him in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders, and officials could not establish a direct link. Mansfield was released, and the case remained unresolved. The most serious and publicized legal proceedings came 5 years after the crime, in 1917, when Reverend George Kelly was indicted. Kelly, a traveling minister with a history of mental instability, had been in Villisca on the night of the Children's Day program. He was eccentric and erratic, with documented behaviors that included sending inappropriate letters and exhibiting voyeuristic tendencies. His obsession with the case, combined with his presence in town that night, made him a prime suspect in the eyes of investigators. Kelly was interrogated extensively, and under pressure he gave a confession in which he admitted to the killings. However, the confession was later recanted, and questions about its validity arose immediately. Reports from the time indicate it was obtained after lengthy and coercive questioning, and without corroborating evidence, its reliability was doubtful. Kelly's first trial ended with a hung jury. The prosecution tried again, and in his second trial he was acquitted. Official records from the court show that no physical evidence tied him to the murders, and the jury was unwilling to convict based on a contested confession and circumstantial claims. After his acquittal, Kelly was never charged again in connection with the Villisca case. Throughout these years, the public frenzy never truly abated. Courtrooms were filled with spectators, and newspapers described large crowds gathering during proceedings. Reporters detailed not only the testimony but also the behavior of the accused men, from Mansfield's alibis to Kelly's strange mannerisms. The case was debated in editorials, sermons, and political discussions. Yet despite years of hearings, grand juries, and 2 criminal trials, no one was ever convicted of the Villisca axe murders. The trials produced more questions than answers, and each suspect who stood accused ultimately walked free. By the end of 1917, the official record showed only what had been known since June 1912. 8 people had been killed with an axe, and the identity of their killer remained unknown. The murders left Villisca permanently altered. In 1912, it had been a small, closely connected town of fewer than 2,500 people, with most residents knowing one another by name. The discovery of 8 brutally murdered townspeople, 6 of them children, shattered that sense of security in ways that were recorded in both local memory and regional press. In the immediate aftermath, fear spread quickly. Newspaper reports from Montgomery County and neighboring towns described families keeping lamps burning all night, doors and windows locked for the first time, and men taking turns standing guard outside their homes. Gun sales rose, as noted in period accounts, and farmers traveling into town carried weapons. The scale of the crime, unprecedented in Iowa's history, meant people could no longer assume safety in their own houses. The atmosphere of suspicion also changed community relationships. With no arrest in the days following the killings, neighbors began to watch one another closely. Strangers passing through town were regarded with distrust. Even among longtime residents, divisions formed. Allegations that prominent townspeople like State Senator Frank Jones might have been involved deepened existing rivalries and hardened political lines. Those who supported the Jones family often accused Josiah Moore's allies of spreading rumors, while others believed Jones had escaped justice through influence. Church attendance rose in the weeks after the murders, according to contemporaneous accounts, but this increase was accompanied by tension. The very event that had brought the Moore family to church that night, the Children's Day program, became a lasting memory for congregants. Reports described children who had participated in the program being deeply affected, and several families withdrew their children from evening gatherings for months afterward. Economic effects were recorded as well. Villisca, like many small towns, depended on the perception of stability to attract business. For years, the name of the town was associated nationally not with farming or commerce, but with the axe murders. Letters preserved in archives show that traveling salesmen and visitors commented on the notoriety, sometimes refusing to lodge overnight. Residents noted with bitterness that Villisca had become, in the words of one Des Moines Register article, the town with the axe. The long, unresolved investigation added another layer of unease. With every new suspect, whether William Mansfield, Reverend George Kelly, or others, attention returned to Villisca. Each arrest revived press coverage, bringing crowds of outsiders and reporters. For some residents, this cycle kept the trauma alive, preventing closure. Families of the victims, particularly relatives of the Moores and Stillingers, endured repeated questioning and public speculation. The house itself, located on East 2nd Street, became a focus of both local grief and morbid curiosity. While some avoided the area entirely, others came to see it, including visitors from outside Montgomery County. Reports from the 1910s and 1920s note that out-of-town travelers sometimes asked directions to the murder house. For those who lived nearby, this attention was both unwelcome and unavoidable, as the crime had marked their community indelibly. Even decades later, the effects were remembered. Survivors of Villisca's 1912 generation often described the murders as the defining event of their childhood or youth. Oral histories collected in the mid-20th century frequently began with recollections of the Night of the Axe. The killings did not simply claim 8 lives. They reshaped the town's identity, leaving a legacy of fear, suspicion, and unwanted notoriety that persisted long after the coroner's inquest had closed. For decades after 1912, the Villisca axe murders remained one of Iowa's most infamous unsolved crimes. While the immediate investigation had ended without a conviction, interest in the case did not disappear. Instead, it reemerged periodically through new suspects, journalistic examinations, and later historical research. In the years following the acquittal of Reverend George Kelly in 1917, Montgomery County authorities never again brought formal charges. Official records show no new prosecutions. The case file remained open but inactive. Yet journalists and crime writers occasionally revisited the murders, especially when other axe-related crimes surfaced in the Midwest. Some reporters in the 1920s and 1930s drew connections between Villisca and a string of unsolved axe murders near railroad lines in Kansas, Colorado, and Illinois. These comparisons were speculative, however, and no verified evidence linked the crimes. In the mid-20th century, the case was largely remembered locally rather than investigated. Residents who had lived through 1912 passed their recollections to younger generations. Oral histories collected by the State Historical Society of Iowa preserved details of community memory, from the fear that followed the murders to the town's frustration with unsolved justice. For the families of the victims, particularly the surviving Stillinger relatives, the murders remained a private grief carried for decades. A resurgence of public attention came in the late 20th century. In 1997, the Villisca house, still standing on East 2nd Street, was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn. They restored it to its 1912 condition using historical photographs, documents, and community input. Their intent was preservation, not tourism alone, though the house quickly became a point of national interest. Articles in regional newspapers and later in national outlets such as the New York Times reported on the restoration. For many, the house represented a tangible link to an unsolved tragedy, preserved as it was when the Moore and Stillinger children last lived there. Academic and journalistic studies also revived the case. Scholars examined the investigative failures of 1912 to 1917, noting the lack of coordination between local law enforcement, private detectives, and federal authorities. Books published in the late 20th and early 21st centuries compiled original newspaper articles, trial transcripts, and inquest testimony, making the material accessible to wider audiences. These works emphasized that while many theories existed, the historical record contained no definitive proof of any single perpetrator. The notoriety of the case grew again in the early 2000s with the rise of true crime media. Documentaries, podcasts, and televised programs explored the Villisca murders, often revisiting the same unresolved questions. Reporters continued to cite the original court documents and preserve testimony, noting that more than a century later, the killings still had no legal resolution. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House operates as both a historical site and a reminder of the town's most devastating moment. Visitors tour the restored home, and historical markers in Villisca provide context about the murders and the families involved. Local historians emphasize that beyond the mystery, the event represents 8 lives lost: Josiah and Sarah Moore, their children Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, and Lena and Ina Stillinger. Over 110 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office retains the historical record, but there is no active investigation. The legacy of the crime continues in Iowa's history books and in national accounts of early 20th century American crime, standing as one of the country's most notorious unsolved multiple homicides. More than a century after June 1912, the Villisca Axe murders remain one of the darkest unsolved crimes in American history. Unlike many small-town tragedies that fade with time, Villisca's story endured because no resolution ever came. Court records, coroner's reports, and preserved testimony show the extent of the official effort, yet none of it brought a conviction. Historians frequently point to the case as an example of early 20th century investigative limitations. Law enforcement in 1912 lacked modern forensic tools. There was no DNA testing, no reliable fingerprint system in rural Iowa, and no standardized coordination between state or federal agencies. Contemporary reports reveal a crime scene compromised by crowds of townspeople before evidence could be preserved, leaving investigators without a clear foundation. The legal proceedings that followed, particularly the 1917 trial of Reverend George Kelly, illustrated the difficulties of securing justice in the absence of physical evidence. Kelly's acquittal ended the last serious attempt at prosecution. From that point forward, the case remained unsolved, with officials unwilling to pursue weak or circumstantial leads. For the families of the victims, the legacy was one of grief and endurance. Relatives of Josiah and Sarah Moore, as well as descendants of the Stillinger family, carried the memory across generations. While their names appeared in newspapers for decades, the families themselves largely remained private, allowing historians rather than relatives to preserve the public record. For Villisca, the murders became inseparable from its identity. Early newspaper articles referred to the community as the Town of the Axe, and even today, its name is most often recognized in connection with the 1912 killings. This notoriety was both a burden and a historical marker, shaping how the town has been remembered across Iowa and the nation. The house on East 2nd Street, preserved in the late 20th century and restored to its 1912 appearance, remains the most visible reminder. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it stands as a site where history is not forgotten. Visitors learn not only about the crime but about the town, the families, and the realities of early 20th century justice. In American true crime history, the Villisca case occupies a significant place alongside other notorious unsolved murders of the era. It reflects both the vulnerabilities of small-town life in the early 1900s and the limitations of the investigative systems of the time. Unlike many crimes, it left behind no confession, no clear evidence, and no definitive suspect. Only the enduring memory of lives lost and a community transformed. The legacy of Villisca is not one of resolution but of permanence. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters, their lives cut short, remain remembered in historical accounts, memorials, and preserved testimony. The case endures in scholarly studies, public history, and the town itself, a reminder that some crimes remain unanswered despite the passage of generations. More than a century has passed, yet the Villisca axe murders remain unsolved. 8 lives were cut short, and a town was forever changed. Despite trials, theories, and decades of investigation, the identity of the killer has never been confirmed. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters live on only in memory, preserved in historical records, restored spaces, and the enduring stories of Villisca. Their tragedy stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the limits of early 20th century justice, and the mysteries that time cannot erase.